When Maxim invented this machine gun, he didn't realize that 20 years later, he would be recommended for honorary membership in the Racket Club of America. And I don't mean tennis.
From cutting-edge technology to game-changing designs, these weapons transformed warfare and altered the course of history. I'm James Hanson, and today we're taking a deep dive into the innovations that revolutionized combat and forever changed military strategy. So, get ready as we explore the stories, the engineering, and the lasting impact of the most influential weapons that changed the face of warfare. Welcome to our countdown of the top 10 weapons in military history. First up, at number 10, it's the Chariot. Dubbed the tanks of the Bronze Age, these weapons provided armies with unprecedented mobility, which was unmatched by infantry at the time. Invented in the 3rd millennium BC, in biblical times, the Chariot was synonymous with military power. The Chariot's main advantage was its speed, which allowed it to drive circles around ranks of infantry, staying out of range while raining arrows down on the foot soldiers. It was using these tactics that the chariot-riding Aryan peoples were able to conquer much of Eurasia and inflict crushing defeats on the more advanced Egyptian and Indian civilizations. The Chariot's main drawbacks were the cost and how unsuitable it was for difficult terrain. It was also an inefficient use of manpower because each vehicle required a crew of 2 or sometimes 3 men, only one of whom actually handled offensive weapons. But there's no doubt the Chariot was one of the most impressive weapons of its time. In at number 9, it's the deadly cannon that revolutionized naval warfare. Now, these weapons packed some serious firepower, allowing ships to be destroyed from a significant distance. Once rifling became standard, their accuracy skyrocketed, making them even more lethal, especially against infantry. Cannons first appeared in China sometime between the 12th and 13th centuries. It almost certainly evolved from earlier weapons such as the fire lance, and the result was a cylindrical weapon that fired projectiles using the explosive pressure of gunpowder. By the Middle Ages, cannons were commonly used in warfare, larger ones for sieges and lighter, more manoeuvrable ones for field artillery.
The greatest naval battle since Trafalgar forced the Kaiser's high-sea squadrons back to their ports and bases for the duration of the war.
Perhaps the most effective use of the cannon was in naval warfare because they allowed vessels to destroy each other from long range. Then, as rifling became more commonplace, cannon fire became deadlier than ever because their accuracy was significantly improved. During World War I, a majority of all deaths were caused by cannon fire, and they were also used widely in World War II. Today, their legacy lives on through weapons such as howitzers and mortars, meaning the cannon more than deserves its place on this list.
It sounded like a tank in the sky, traveling at better than 300 miles an hour. Somehow or other, it survived the curtain of fire that was stitched across the sky by the gun emplacements on the ground, and it exploded with deadly results on London.
Moving on now to number 8, and it's cruise missiles. Their precision makes them ideal for hitting military targets in urban areas, striking with devastating accuracy while sparing nearby civilian structures. Now, the cruise missile is designed to deliver large warheads over long distances with high precision, with modern cruise missiles capable of travelling at high subsonic, supersonic, or even hypersonic speeds. They're essentially jet-propelled pilotless aircraft, and their accuracy makes them especially useful in attacking military targets in urban areas whilst limiting civilian damage. The forerunner to the cruise missile was the V-1 missile, which was used by the Germans to attack London towards the end of World War II. Of course, you could argue that Japan's kamikaze planes were a form of cruise missile, but their development really took off during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And perhaps the most famous cruise missile of them all is the Tomahawk, which entered service in 1983 and has been used by America and its allies ever since. Now, some people might say, hang on a minute, what makes the cruise missile better than the ballistic missile? Well, of course, it completely depends on the nature of the mission. Cruise missiles are better for precision strikes, while ballistic missiles offer long-range and high-speed capabilities for strategic objectives. And when people talk about the threat posed by things like intercontinental ballistic missiles, what they're often talking about really is the threat posed by the warheads they're carrying, specifically nuclear warheads. But more on that later on. At number 7, we have the longbow, one of the most powerful weapons of the medieval period, often most famously associated with the 100 Years' War. Although it's often thought to have originated in Wales, the longbow can actually be traced back to the Neolithic period, with evidence that a D-shaped bow dates back to around 2700 BC. By the 100 Years' War, the English and Welsh longbow gave Edward III's forces a significant advantage over the French, who could only fire 3 to 5 volleys per minute, in comparison to the 10 or 12 arrows capable of being fired by the English and Welsh bowmen in the same time. The demand for skilled archers meant longbow practice was even allowed on Sundays. By the time of Henry V's famous victory at Agincourt, some longbows were as tall as 6 feet and capable of firing an arrow almost 1,000 feet. The English were outnumbered almost 5 to 1 at Agincourt. Because of the majority of their troops were longbowmen, they simply rained arrows down upon the French, who became unnerved and spread in all directions trying to escape. The last battle involving the longbow took place in 1644 during the English Civil War, but it remains an iconic weapon of history, being closely associated with the great medieval battles and even the legend of Robin Hood. Next up, we have the Automat Kalashnikov, or Automatic Kalashnikov, better known through its acronym, the AK-47. This weapon was developed by the Soviet sergeant and small arms designer Mikhail Kalashnikov. It was originally intended to replace the rifles and submachine guns used by the Soviets at the end of World War II, but it quickly became one of the most famous and deadliest guns on the planet. Having become the official assault rifle of the Soviet Union, it was quickly adopted by other members of the Warsaw Pact. The USSR also provided AK-47s to various other anti-Western or communist countries and insurgencies, meaning they were used in the Vietnam War, the South African Border War, the Colombian Civil War and the Congo Civil War. In more recent years, the Kalashnikov has also been used during the civil wars in Libya and Syria, during the war in Afghanistan and during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But what makes the AK-47 so popular? First and foremost, it is one of the most reliable weapons in the world, being so durable that it even continues to function after it's been dunked in boggy water or sand. The AK-47 is also extremely simple to use and can be disassembled and reassembled even by children in less than 30 seconds. Plus, it's affordable and easy to produce. But the Kalashnikov has also taken on wider symbolic significance. In Russia, the weapon is a source of huge national pride, and its use during civil wars and insurgencies has made it a symbol of revolution around the world. So much so, there's even an AK-47 on the flag of Mozambique. Mikhail Kalashnikov died as recently as 2013. Shortly before he passed, he wrote a letter to the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, expressing spiritual pain at having invented one of the world's deadliest weapons. "If my rifle claimed people's lives," he wrote, "then can it be that I was to blame for the deaths?" Right, we're halfway through our list now, which brings us to the Trebuchet, a siege engine and type of catapult which uses a rotating arm with a sling attached to the tip to launch a projectile. It first appeared in China by the 4th century BC, and its use then spread westwards and was adopted by the Byzantines, Persians and Arabs by the 6th and 7th centuries, before becoming a staple part of warfare by the Middle Ages. The tale of the trebuchet is one of 2 distinct variations: the traction trebuchet and the counterweight trebuchet. The traction is the simpler model and basically relies on a large group of people yanking ropes to generate enough force for the arm of the weapon to propel its artillery. And by contrast, the counterweight trebuchet was powered by engineering rather than raw manpower. Instead of people pulling on ropes, the counterweight simplifies things by having a weighted box attached to the rope. Then just release on command and the trebuchet fires. As a weapon of war, they're probably best associated with the Crusades of the Middle Ages. Richard the Lionheart used trebuchets in the Battle of Jaffa in 1192, and his opponent Saladin also used similar siege engines. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the use of the trebuchet declined, especially after the advent of gunpowder-based artillery. And these days, you're more likely to see a trebuchet at a historical reenactment or in a pumpkin launching competition. But in its time, the Trebuchet was a seriously effective piece of kit.
This latest in Army tanks is said to be superior to anything the Nazis have in action. The welded 30-ton monster has a 75mm gun mounted in a turret that revolves a full 360 degrees.
Next up, we've got the fearsome tanks, game changers on the battlefield. These armoured behemoths were born out of the brutal stalemate of World War I's Western Front, designed to smash through trenches and barbed wire. The tank is essentially any heavily armed and armoured combat vehicle that moves on two endless metal chains called tracks. Forerunners to the tank, such as Chariot and battering rams, have been used for over 2,000 years. But it was only at the turn of the 20th century that the tank as we know it today came to the fore. The first completed tank prototype in history has become known as Little Willie, and it was built in the autumn of 1915 as part of the development of the British Mark I tank. The second model, called Big Willie, quickly followed, and the innovation never stopped. Tanks did see action in World War I and were important for crossing trenches and damaging German morale. But it wasn't until World War II that we saw some of history's most infamous tank battles, notably in Kursk, El Alamein and the Battle of the Bulge.
Hogan's task force and many another armored unit were carving up the Germans' best equipment. The Bulge had gone deep into Allied lines, but finally the Yanks had slowed the enemy down.
Since then, tank design has gone to a whole new level, and they're still a central feature of modern tank warfare. Whether it's on the front line in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, or recent American operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you're interested in finding out more, make sure you check out our episode on the top 10 main battle tanks in history. Into our top 3 now, and on to the Maxim machine gun. Hiram Maxim was an American inventor who, over the years, had devised mousetraps, steam pumps, and even an amusement park ride. But in 1884, he created his most famous invention, the first fully automatic machine gun in the world. By employing one of the earliest recoil-operated firing systems, the Maxim was able to quickly excrete a spent cartridge and insert the next one, whereas earlier firearms required a manual mechanism. As a result, it was far less labour-intensive than other early rapid-fire weapons. It had a 250-round canvas belt feeding system and a rate of fire of 600 rounds per minute. Plus, by reducing gas build-up in the barrel, the Maxim was able to fire more loads in extended sessions without the barrel overheating. Whereas most weapons at the time were air-cooled, the Maxim was water-cooled to sustain its rate of fire. And to cap it all off, not only was the Maxim more accurate when fired at distant targets, it was also renowned for being far more reliable than its counterparts. It was first used in combat in 1893 by the British South Africa Company's police against Matabele warriors in modern-day Zimbabwe. Just 5 Maxim guns killed about 1,500 warriors. That set the tone for much of the Maxim's early use, being deployed by European nations in their pursuit of colonies. As the 20th century dawned, use of the Maxim continued to grow, including in the Russo-Japanese War and most famously in World War I, giving rise to the term the Machine Gun War. But even to this day, the Maxim still sees some use on the battlefield, including by Ukrainian troops fighting the Russian invaders. Second in line is what are officially known as unmanned aerial vehicles, but better known to you and I as drones. These weapons have many uses outside of warfare, of course, including filming and photography, environmental monitoring and product deliveries. But in recent years, drones have become increasingly important on the battlefield. The first pilotless vehicles were developed in Britain and the US during the First World War, although neither country used them operationally. Reconnaissance UAVs were first used on a large scale during the Vietnam War. And they also started being used in other ways, including as decoys, missile launches, and for the dropping of propaganda leaflets. After Vietnam, more countries began investigating the use of UAVs. New models have become more sophisticated and are capable of flying at a greater height and for longer. And in recent years, solar-powered drones have been developed to tackle the problem of fueling longer flights. Drones now have many functions, and their use in warfare has significantly expanded over recent decades. They're mostly used for surveillance and reconnaissance in areas where it's not safe for troops to go. but they're also increasingly being deployed as weapons and can be used for targeted strikes. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, drones have become a key part of the fighting. Ukrainian soldiers have adapted low-cost commercial drones into effective weapons, and Russia has increasingly relied on Iranian-supplied Shahed drones, making the conflict the biggest drone war in history. If some of the weapons on this list belong to the past, then the use of drone warfare is likely to only expand in years to come.
When this takes place, thousands of tons of atomized earth, stone, brick and steel are sucked up into the mushroom cloud and become highly radioactive.
All right, taking our top spot at number 1 is the globally feared atomic bomb. The story of the atomic bomb began around the turn of the 20th century, when a small number of physicists began to consider the phenomenon of radioactivity, the behaviour of alpha particles and the properties of various materials when irradiated. What started as an academic endeavour quickly became a very real-life issue when the world once again descended into a global conflict and a new weapons race began. By 1945, the US had successfully developed and tested an atomic bomb, overseen by the legendary scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer.
I have been asked whether, in the years to come, it will be possible to kill 40 million American people in the 20 largest American towns by the use of atomic bombs in a single night. I am afraid that the answer to that question is yes.
Almost immediately, the question for President Truman became if and when to use it, especially given the enormous loss of life its deployment would inevitably cause. As 1945 wore on, and with Japan still refusing to surrender, Truman approved its use, first on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki. Estimates suggest more than 200,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed, either by the explosion itself or from the effects of radiation. Japan surrendered unconditionally just days later. Even now, the debate as to whether Truman was right to drop the bomb continues. As of 2024, 9 countries possess nuclear weapons: the US, Russia, the UK, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan and North Korea. But to this day, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only use of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict. We can only hope it stays that way. And there we have it. That wraps up our list of the top 10 weapons of war that shaped military history. As always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, History Undone with James Hanson. And I'll see you next time. Goodbye.